There we go. Hello, everybody. We are live. I'm excited to have my mentor here and wealth of knowledge, one of the smartest human beings I've ever met. And the reason I can tell you that, because there's nothing that he says that is not in an anatomy or a biochemistry book. So it's all irrefutable if you know what you're talking about. And that's what we're going to be doing today. We're going to help people understand what is going on in information to help make good choices for their health. So good afternoon, or actually good morning, Dr. Walker.
Good morning.
How have you been in your travels?
Oh, it's good. It's different being in the cold weather for those of you in the US, leaving that nice 80, 100 degree weather. Well, I'm down here in the southern hemisphere where it's winter, and so it's cold.
Yeah, well, we're excited here. I know you just wrapped up a couple series of your cranial adjusting courses. We were able to connect with a dentist in my area. How did that education series go for it with everybody?
It was very good, and it's good to see a lot of new faces and new blood, and hopefully we can get that started. But still, you're so far ahead of the curve for most of these people that it's good to see that we have a lot of young people like you out there doing it. And now we're going to start doing a little bit more on the sleep front, which is really important, as you know. And so it's a matter of getting a lot of people up to speed and trying to get some up to your speed. But for those of you out there, Chris is already on the ball, so it's time to take it up another level.
Yeah, well, that's what people tuned in for today. We're definitely deep dive, but and just a little feedback about the cranial work. And I can't stress it enough that if you are a chiropractor and a dentist, how important this is, because I remember going to chiropractic school and I prayed for the worst cases and I studied hard to be prepared for it. And I had a great analysis of my structural correction technique, but I still wasn't seeing some postural shifts. And now that I can get all of that done, all these post-concussive lip lap cases just keep dropping in my lap that have been through the medical gambit. You know, they have no cognitive function, all kinds of neurological problems. And then to even the chiropractic neurologists, you know, we've talked about how they're working through different pathways, but the brain is still torqued. And when you untorque the brain and fire up the frontal lobe with the adjustment and free up 2/3 of the cranial nerves from the posterior part of the skull, it all changes. You know, all the vestibular problems change, all the ocular problems change, and it's so simple. And then the people that referred them to me are floored. And you know, it's hard to understand, but easy to apply. And I just can't thank you enough, because there are people who have been written off that show up here at 5% power, and they've been that way for a minute, and it's like the power comes back on, you know, and they think they have Parkinson's and they can't balance because their body doesn't want to put weight on the joint that is offloading. And, you know, they then go get dental work and lock in their skull to a bite and get stuck there. So now, last time we talked a lot about the obstructive side. You know, now we're transitioning to the order of care. You know, obviously obstructive, there's always going to be there. And then we talk about the level of physiological or sleep stage. Maybe you can explain what physiological means in the order of care regarding sleep.
Sure. And like you said, it's so important to deal with the structure first, because it's amazing how much clears up when you clear up structure. It's like, even when it comes to sleep stages, when it comes to the inflammation in the throat, the neck, the head, and with Alzheimer's and Parkinson's being on such a forefront, mild cognitive impairment, as we'll say, so much of that gets cleared up if we just address the structural aspect. But there's another level that should be included, always should be included, is the nutritional component. And we're seeing a lot of that popularized these days with sleep disorders when it's a health disorder. But last time we talked about sleep in that way, and I think a lot of the terms are being misused currently, because when we get into the whole field of sleep and sleep disorders, as we said last time, it's popular for people to focus on the respiration part of it. But really, sleep can be separated into two parts. We have a respiration component, and we have the actual sleep component. And the sleep component is greatly ignored, and I don't know why. But when we talked about respiratory, we also have respiratory broken down into two parts of, number one, we can't breathe. That's obstructive apnea. We also have the don't or won't breathe, and they get lumped together, and they're so vastly different. When we talk about won't and can't is obstruction. Won't is your body is telling you to slow down the breathing or even stop the breathing for a period of time to help to balance the chemistry. We know that if we want to increase, say we're free diving and we want to be able to hold our breath longer, what do? We hyperventilate for a little bit to build up oxygen so that then we can dive and let the CO2 build up. You don't breathe because you're low on oxygen. You breathe because you're high in CO2. And so it's that oxygen CO2 balance that determines our respiration. And when CO2 builds up, we have to breathe and blow off so that we can exchange. A whole lot of what happens while we're sleeping is that we don't have enough CO2. And CO2 is one of those things that helps us buffer the acids in our blood, mineral carbonates. And if we don't store the CO2 and store the minerals, then we're going to have to keep using our respiration to manage it's called metabolic pH. And any physiology book, first chapter is usually about managing pH. And we have metabolic management and respiratory management. And what we see in sleep disorders of this nature of won't breathe or don't breathe is using respiration to manage metabolism. And that's not the way it should be. And the key to that whole thing is having enough minerals to bind the CO2 to use as a buffer. Because CO2 is a potent buffer. If we don't have CO2, the body either holds its breath or it makes ammonia. Two things that we really don't want to have to happen, but they work. Like in your gut, H. pylori and a lot of bacteria will actually produce ammonia to help manage their own local pH. Your brain does the same thing. Your brain will actually use ammonia to help balance pH. But anybody that does that, you'll notice this 3 or 4 o'clock in the morning, get up and have to go to the toilet. That's because ammonia, while it works on the brain, is quite an irritant to the bladder. So if you're waking up at night and having to pee a lot, that's telling you you're using ammonia as a buffer. And that's one of the things that says it would be a whole lot better if we were using minerals. And one of the keys to that whole respiratory thing is looking at how your body manages its pH. And the biggest key to that is making sure you have the minerals. And most people today are deficient in minerals. And one of the key things with that respiratory, or AHI, as we talked about last time, is the misuse of it as obstructive, and it's not. People will say they conflate apnea hypopnea index, AHI, and they call it obstructive apnea. And that's just wrong, literally wrong, figuratively wrong.
But look at the term, right? Hypopnea, and I don't, we don't want to get too technical on people, but doctor, what he's talking about is we had the obstruction, which would be, misformed maxilla, tongue ties, swollen tissue, and then in there we're going to get into the physiological side, but he's talking about hypopnea, and I don't think you can stress enough how important minerals are in the biochemistry setup in our body. I don't think people understand why that's important and what you're trying to say. I think most people think of like supplementation as like a difference of a pill. It's no different. Like, I can't go to sleep, so I'm gonna take melatonin. But that's like so far down the barrel on a bigger problem in your chemistry, right? So we have these common things that people talk about and do, but that can be very dangerous for you. So along with what you're saying, waking up at 3 a.m. or 4 a.m. to pee, but also staying awake at that. And that these are other health problems that you may be having. So maybe you can explain to people a little bit more about why these getting your minerals checked and right are important.
Right. Well, if we look at biochemistry, everything in the body, things just don't spontaneously happen. They always have an enzyme or a broker that takes two chemicals and either puts them together or takes them apart. And each of those steps always requires an enzyme to make it work. And every enzyme requires a battery to make it work. And the batteries for all the enzymes are minerals. So every enzyme needs a battery or it won't work. You could have a great phone. If there's no battery, it doesn't work. And the minerals are used for a lot of things. The minerals bind to carbonates to help make pH buffers. And at the same time, every enzyme needs a battery. And there's some of these batteries, these minerals that are used in like magnesium, hundreds and hundreds of enzymes use that. There's some very specific enzymes that will use things like selenium or copper or, molybdenum. And these are trace minerals. Now, if you don't have those, then the whole process stops and it's going to disrupt the system. And that's why before we get into a lot of the sleep stages or sleep things, we want to make sure that our breathing is okay. We have the obstructions, mechanical appliances and CPAP, which rarely work, whereas most of that is tissue inflammation, which we can address with nutrition by far. Structural adjusting the neck helps, adjusting the skull helps, along with anti-inflammatory nutrition. And we have to look at what's inflammatory and what's not. This is what we call physiologic obstructive apnea, because it's not mechanical, it's tissue inflammation. And if the inflammation is causing it, well, that's a different story. Like if you can't breathe through your nose at night, it's not about forcing air in your lungs or repositioning your jaw. It's dealing with the inflammation. How do we know if that's inflammatory or mechanical? Well, if you would do something like a nasal decongestant or like the Afrin challenge, if you use Afrin in your nose and it clears it up, well, that's telling you that's inflammatory, right? Right away, it's inflammation. Now we have to get to the cause of that inflammation, be it allergies, histamines, food you're eating, things like that. And there's not an appliance in the world that's going to overcome that. That's tissue inflammation. And it doesn't mean we go in there with a scalpel and we take out everything that's inflammatory, like tonsils, adenoids, turbinates. It's not a surgical solution. This is a nutritional solution that we need to address for that physiologic obstruction. In the same way,
dangerous do you think it is?
Generally minerals.
Yeah, how dangerous do you think it is when people are using drugs to inhibit that inflammation cycle? Like, because it's obviously your body's giving you information about something.
A lot of it depends upon how it happens. I mean, if you had to do something for the inflammation, I think doing something local is a lot better for you than doing something chronic, systemic anti-inflammatories, because inflammation is a signal that your body needs to address and heal or prevent things from getting in. We're seeing a lot of the post-viral antigen persistence, where we see a lot of people with more allergies now than ever before because the immune system has been disrupted. Sorry, I don't know who's dealing with me down here, but there's a better way to deal with it. There's always a short-term solution, and then there's a better long-term solution. And that's what we'll talk about with some of the things that are inflammatory, and we can even get into a lot of deeper stuff on that. But all that has to do with that respiratory aspect. And I always think that breathing is most important when it comes to sleep, because if you can't breathe, it sucks. But once we've addressed the breathing part of it, there's a whole nother realm that we look at in sleep disorders that is just being totally ignored. And this is the aspect of actual sleep. And if you go to look on a lot of things, the number one solution people do is, oh, we'll take melatonin, right? We'll do CPAP and melatonin. And it's so far down the pathway that they're missing most of what we're dealing with when we use that term sleep.
Yeah. If I'm picking up what you're saying, we're missing a lot of information if we're just forcing air down the throat and it's not an obstruction, it's due to inflammation, and then we're having trouble with our sleep stages and we're doing the downstream effect of just putting melatonin. I don't think people understand how much inflammation actually affects your sleep. And then I was even studying physiology, you don't realize that respiration is helped through your metabolism. I don't think people understand that. They think breathing is this mechanical thing, but it has to occur through your metabolism of the minerals that you're talking about.
Right. We look at the blood, we look at hemoglobin. Blood is not, we tend to think of it as oxygen delivery, and it's not. Hemoglobin is actually a buffer, and we don't deliver oxygen where it's low. Hemoglobin's kind of default state is to hold oxygen. But when it doesn't just give up oxygen to low oxygen areas like we think or we're taught, or it picks up CO2. And its affinity for CO2 is so much higher than oxygen that you could have low oxygen in your tissues and hemoglobin is just going to hold on to it. It's when the CO2 builds up that it gives oxygen. It trades. Hemoglobin is never empty. And its default is oxygen in one part and holding CO2 in the veins. But hemoglobin is more sensitive to hydrogen than oxygen. So if it's acidic, it will pick up the hydrogen and give the oxygen, which makes water in a way. It's also more sensitive to glucose. So it'll pick up these things and then give off the oxygen. But we see a lot of hemoglobin now that's bound with sugar or glucose, glycosylated hemoglobin. And once hemoglobin, red blood cells, take up glucose, they can never carry oxygen again for the life of that blood cell. So you'll already have low oxygen saturation because it's bound to glucose. This is the test they do called A1C that you see all the drugs for nowadays and things like that, because your A1C score tells you that you've got a lot of glucose in there. And their solution is not to limit the sugar, not to help your body process sugar better, but to not let your red blood cells take it up. Well, you're kind of inhibiting the whole function of a red blood cell when you do that. What are you doing? You're stopping the body's ability to deal with glucose properly and burn it properly and do all these other things by inhibiting an enzyme that actually is doing something useful.
So this is a golden nugget for people to understand. A lot of people are suffering out there with autoimmune diseases, low-grade cellular inflammation. And one of the main tests is an A1C test that they'll do. And what they're being recommended, you're saying, is actually hurting them long-term because it's not addressing the root cause of the glucose being attached to the hemoglobin.
Yeah, they're not dealing with the primary thing of why can't your body deal with glucose in the proper way? Or are you actually getting too much glucose and not dealing with it efficiently, which is so common? And that's going to affect saturation, that's going to affect sleep, that's going to affect your immune system, that's going to affect your brain more than anything.
So, and then I think a lot of people typically think like CO2 is bad, right? And we want oxygen, but there has to be this ratio that you've mentioned CO2 a few times. It sounds like it's very important.
CO2 is really important to the body. It's one of the ways. It's a byproduct of making energy, but it's not a waste. It's how you bind minerals to be used for pH. You want to make sure that you can use the CO2 properly and make sure you have enough CO2. If you don't have enough CO2, what are you going to do? You're going to stop breathing to raise the CO2 levels. Now, if we're asleep and this happens, they'll call that dysfunction. Well, it's your body doing what it has to do. CO2 is so important. It's not a waste product only when it's in excess. And why not just have enough minerals to bind it? Then it's not wasted. It's used. All of your tissues store CO2 with minerals, mineral carbonates, to be used as buffers. It's really important. It's only the excess that gets taken up.
And then, you hear this out in the health world, you hear oxidative stress, right? That has these, as we age, we create more oxidative stress. And what you're saying is if people had more minerals, they could hold more CO2 and naturally buffer out any kind of oxidative stress and not only decrease their aging, but also affect their sleep and breathing.
Correct.
So are people listening? Maybe we could give them some insight on, instead of doing the short-term thing for the drug, maybe what it would look like for proper sleep nutrition. What are some of these things that we can do if we had, POSA, like, physiological inflammation in the body, and then maybe go through hypopnea and central for people?
The step number one is to make sure that the immune system is functioning properly. Make sure that we have what's called a local level immune system, or the innate immune system. We have a natural system, and then we have the adaptive system. And the adaptive system gets all the press. It's got great PR. And part of the adaptive system is antibodies, and they get a whole bunch of press. They think it's great. In reality, your body does not use antibodies to fight a virus, okay? Everybody wants to have antibodies against a virus. Your body does not use antibodies to fight a virus. It uses natural killer cells. These aren't T cells, and these aren't B cells. These are local Rambocytes, as we call them. They will look for something that is me or not me. And me, good, not me, kill. Very aggressive little things. These are what have vigilance for cancer. These are what deal with viruses. These are what deal with any cell that's going to die, autophagy. So autophagy is an old cell. Your body says, it doesn't look like me anymore. Let's get rid of it. This is what a virus invades a cell. Antibodies don't deal with that. And even B cells really don't deal with that. It's these natural killer cells that deal with that. And so the two arms of our immune system have just become way out of balance. And that local system is what we need to support more than anything. Because right now, the whole series has been pushed towards the antibody and even B cells. And we've neglected, we actually inhibit this natural system. And when we inhibit this natural system, we get chronic viruses, chronic inflammation, cancers. We don't want those. And yet everything we're doing is promoting them. That's why right now we're seeing a lot of turbo cancers and way higher cancer rates, because we're inhibiting the system that actually is vigilant against them. And that's the sad reality of what we're dealing with now. Whereas if we want to actually focus on our natural system, we have to support natural killer cells, which means we have to let our system distinguish between our self and our not self. And there's certain things that we can take nutritionally. The number one nutrient to help that system are the beta glucans. Beta glucans they have their own receptor in your gut. You take them up, they activate natural killer cells, and they start going around and checking all the other cells. Another simple thing to help increase innate immune system is become trendy for the wrong reasons, but intermittent fasting. Anytime we're in a state of calorie deficit, our body says, well, I'm not going to waste energy on old dead cells, and we'll start to look for these other cells. And that's going to say, okay, anything that doesn't have a pristine membrane, we're going to go after and we're going to kill. And the things that really shut down the vigilance is excess glucose. Because excess sugar in your blood, be it from glucose with fructose or just straight high fructose corn syrup or high glucose or sugars, too much of that is going to distract the body and pull it into the blood. And this whole natural immune system gets shut down. We see with natural immune system, a lot of the medications people are taking to stop symptoms, like colds and fevers, flus. When we talked about these systemic anti-inflammatories, these are things that will actually shut off the system that's designed to look for and kill bad cells. The part of the body that gives you a fever, or that gives you chills, or that gives you pain, all these things, they're local systems that are based on that innate immune system. And that's why in the US, if you watch television and you see the drug commercials, at the bottom of most of them, they will say, do not take this, or can cause tuberculosis or these other infections or cancers, or do not take if you have a vaccine or going to be vaccinated or pregnant or nursing. That's because they know that they're inhibiting this system. And this is really dangerous during pregnancy, because pregnancy is a state of self, not self. And a lot of the rise in miscarriages that we're seeing right now, over 300% up in miscarriages and stillbirths, it's because that self, not self, is out of kilter. And we're looking at a child as being not self rather than a part of self, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. What it really drives home for me, and hearing it a few times now with the CO2 binding capacity, when that glucose goes on to the hemoglobin, you're saying that that's affecting our immune system. So I hope people are listening that, if you are having some autoimmune diagnoses or metabolic syndrome problems, of how dangerous the glucose is and how it's affecting your blood cells and your body's ability to actually breathe. So you might think you have diabetes, but you really technically have a breathing problem because of your diet is affecting that. And circling back a little deeper, it's a very common in the medical world to mutilate the innate immune system that's inflamed with, not even infected, just inflamed with tonsils, adenoids, turbinates, ear tubes, for kids that might have had a maxillary that didn't form right from a birth thing. What do you think about that?
No, it's quite common. It's just a simple factor of this annoying fire alarm. We can fix that by just taking the batteries out of it. And no fire alarm, I guess that means there's no fire. Well, it's not the way it works, It's like if you have a huge fire and you're blaming the fire trucks for clogging up the street. It's like, well, they're trying to do their job. If we didn't have a fire and a fire alarm, we wouldn't have all these annoying fire trucks. And the solution is not to defund the fire department. It's to put out the fire and not start it again,
Well, it's also interesting is they're going to technically open up the airway, whether they do it with an appliance or forcing air down, and then they're going to technically try to open it up with removing inflamed tissue, but then you destroy a part of your immune system you need down the road to recognize self versus self. So are we really setting young kids up or young adults up for success by not letting that innate immune system develop and doing these interventions too soon for them, or not addressing the inflammatory side properly? What do you think about that?
And beyond just interrupting it, we're removing functional grade immune tissue. We're taking it out. It will never be there again. It's not going to grow back. Some of it will try, but you're turning off the immune system. And that's going to have it is having a lot of consequences downstream. If you look at the immune system rates these days, for the people that have and have not had tissue removed, there's a big difference.
So you're noticing a difference that in down cycle, especially now that the bodies are not recognizing themselves as much, people that had some of these early interventions are having a harder time.
Oh, it's documented. It's in the literature. They don't
All right,
like to
well, get up
no,
your minerals, get your
nobody-
beta-glucans going, people. This is great information to impure your immune system the way your body's supposed to work. Not
You'll see a lot of trendy supplements like mushrooms. Okay, mushrooms are rich in beta-glucans, and that's why the mushroom caps have been used for thousands and thousands of years, from reishi to shiitake to maitake to all these different mushroom blends. They're doing it for the beta-glucans, and that's because your body doesn't make them, but that is one thing we can take from the outside that does turn on that vigilance. We get a lot of these same factors from colostrum. I mean, this is what breast milk has in it, but as adults, we can still take clean, purified colostrum, and it will have a lot of the things that will turn on the innate immune system and take the load off of the adaptive system, because colostrum has a lot of active immunoglobulin. Immunoglobulin is another word for antibody. But if you take some of the raw ones, then your body doesn't have to make them. Therefore, we don't turn off, because those are competitive systems. You're either making natural killer cells or you're making antibodies. You can't do both at the same time. The systems are competitive. And so if we take raw ones, we don't have to make them, then this system also gets a boost.
So you're noticing with colostrum, people are helping to boost their innate immunity and take some stress off their system.
Correct. Another thing that really helps this system work there is vitamin D, D3. Now, for the immune system, D3 helps to activate the B cells in an innate system and not the antibody system. Now, for this use of vitamin D, you don't need vitamin K. We see a lot of people, they have to have D, you have to have K with it. Well, not for the immune system and not for the brain, only for the bones. And so if you're going to do it every day, I advise D3 with K2. But if you're going to do it for your immune system or for your brain, you don't need the K. You want higher doses of D without the K, like 10,000, 20,000 units for your immune system. 5,000 a day is kind of minimum for your basic functioning, and I recommend that with K2. But when you're dealing with the immune system, you don't need the K at all.
So what Dr. Walker is talking about here is the importance of sunlight and steroid hormones.
Some people cannot convert the sun to active forms of D3. It's very common when you have darker pigmentation. African skin, Hispanic skin, they're chronically low in D, especially if they live in the northern hemisphere.
There you go.
Living in Mexico, we see so many people with low vitamin D levels, even though they're dark skinned and they're in the sun all day long. Just historically, genetically, they don't convert sunlight into D3. And that's one of the supplements I think people should be taking. If you had to pick one of the primary ones that you need to take, it is vitamin D3.
I've read a lot too. It's like you can only live so many degrees of where your bloodline is from the equator and prime meridian, as far as like how that relates. Just because like you're African or Mexican and you can live in Detroit doesn't mean you should.
Exactly. Or if you do, take it up. That's what we see a lot of with seasonal disorders and, sunlight, dark pigment, northern hemisphere. It doesn't work that way.
Yeah, and also obviously D3 ties into cholesterol and then how we convert into our steroid hormones, which there's no shortage of endocrine dysfunction when we see chronic pain people, and what we're talking about here with gut health, right? Maybe we can talk about that a little bit.
And when it comes to neurotransmitters, brain chemistry, vitamin D is essential for brain chemistry. because the only way you make neurotransmitters is to take one of 3 or 4 amino acids, and they all come from the same 3 basic amino acids, but they're in a ring form, and ring forms are pretty tight. If we're going to crack it open so we can use it, that place where it cracks requires vitamin D. And that's where, for all of our sleep stages that we talk about, or melatonin, the bottom line of it all, they all require vitamin D for that to work. And doesn't need K2 for that. But in order for the brain to work, you have to have sufficient amount of D.
Yeah, so if people, we're talking about in-depth stuff, but we talked about before of looking things down the barrel and what's upstream. And we was talking about this ring. It's called the aromatic amino acids. And there's a few of them with tyrosine, tryptophan, phenylalanine are essential. And then obviously acetyl-CoA, you need the choline. And this is why just taking melatonin doesn't work. You need vitamin D up top to convert all these other things to crack it open for the system to work. So, and it all comes back to sleep nutrition, right, with proper vitamins and minerals to run these processes. So just having a depleted body and not being able to sleep and putting melatonin in there, just trying to knock yourself out, is not helping you in any way, shape, or form.
Right. Well, it's can actually do you disservice long term, especially. And because that gets you into the actual aspect of sleep. We talk about respiration, we talk about the immune system, we talk about these things that have to do with inflammation, and yet none of those are really sleep. And if we want to focus on sleep, which is what's essential for repair of our brain and consolidating memories and longevity, right? Because in order to live a long, healthy life, we have to have our brain working. We have to have repair of neural tissue. This is what sets up Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, all these cognitive impairments that we see, as well as consolidating memory throughout the day, learning, children. And so important if you're learning new tasks, if you want the brain to make new connections, and have an old dog teaching them new tricks, and much less a young dog teaching them the proper tricks. Yet brain has to work. And this is what sleep's all about. Sleep is not passive turning off and letting things rest. Sleep is about repair and consolidation. And this is not passive. This takes a lot of energy. It's just different. And we're so vulnerable when we're sleeping. I mean, we're very vulnerable. We're one of the animals that sleeps the longest of all. And it can be very scary on the nervous system because you're vulnerable. But it's required for our frontal cortex and the parts of the brain that make us different, is this ability to repair and regenerate and consolidate and to remember and to learn. And this is what humans require. Otherwise, we're just running on brain stems like a lot of brain dead people running around out there today.
Yeah, I can't put this in caps enough. People required. We need to repair the neural tissue and then consolidate the memory. We need to process things that we take into our day and go through these different functions. So sleep is actually very active. It's not passive. Maybe we can touch on this a little bit. I meet a lot of people in the practice or out in public that, feel anxious. So they feel like they need to have some alcohol after a stressful moment or before they need to go to bed, or some nicotine or tobacco to help calm them down. But then down the road, it's, impacting their sleep, and it could have a negative repair on this, right? On impact. Maybe you can talk about what people are doing to self-soothe, but it's actually exacerbating their problem.
Yeah, it's a matter of, when we look at what it actually takes to go through the steps of sleeping, which is that you have to think about sleeping just like we think about exercise. It's good, it's essential. It's like you don't do these things. There's a lot of self medications that people do that work while you're awake, but what are they doing in the other phases of sleep? And that's where, if you think about, there's a lot of partial, I hate to use the term misinformation, but there's a lot of partial and misused information about sleep. we hear things like melatonin or GABA or light or these things. And if we, I mean, I don't blame anybody for information they got in the 70s or the 80s, no, back in the 1900s. Because there was, I was studying brain chemistry in the early 80s, and there was very little information. And we didn't know much about it. And we didn't know how things worked. We're just starting to, we're still working on it quite a bit. We still don't know everything because the brain's pretty amazing, but that's what makes us human. If we look at actual sleep, we know we go through not 4 stages of sleep, really. I mean, we all have this light sleep stage that happens. There's a term called sleep pressure. When you get tired and you feel like, okay, I'm going to go to sleep. Now, sometimes this happens in the daytime, which it shouldn't. It should be happening at night. And one of the triggers for sleep pressure is when the sun starts to go down. If you've ever watched a sunset, you watch the light kind of change from a blue to an orange or to a red. That red sunset, that tone shift. What that does, I'm going to give you an overview of the total sleep, and then we can break it down.
Sure.
Normally what happens is when things start to change, when the sun goes down, your brain recognizes this. And it starts to prepare for this active thing that we call sleep. And what it does at first is it starts to shift your brain chemistry from this super active, vigilant neurotransmitter that we call dopamine that runs the front of the brain. And that's where a whole lot of daytime activity is, really fast, frenetic waveforms where you're constantly scouring the environment to see what threats are out there and what's going on, and learning and trying to draw conclusions. Your brain starts to suppress that. And it does that by stimulating a neurotransmitter called GABA. Now, when it's doing this GABA thing, it's also decreasing its ability to regulate its neural pH, just a consequence of using glutamine to do that. Glutamate and glutamine are involved in GABA. That's the G part of it. MSG affects this part of it, right? But that GABA is what starts to slow the brain down, and it gives you that nodding, that a little bit of sleep pressure. That's what we call light or sleep entry. Once we actually turn the lights out and we close our eyes, we drop a little bit slower into the waveforms. And this is what we kind of have, this light, vigilant sleep. You wake up easy. This is what you get into. This is when a lot of times you feel that jerking or those hypnotic jerks and stuff like that, or leg twitches. After lunch, we sit around and watch people in lectures doing the big okay because they're nodding because they're just going to sleep. Or it just happens when you're driving. It lowers that brain wave down. And this is our stage 2 or N2 sleep. This is where most people spend the bulk of the night. If we want to go deeper into sleep, we need really slow brain waves. These are very, very vulnerable brain waves. Noises outside, light, dogs, kids, parties, parades, everything that's going on outside. This will not let you go there. But this is the serotonin sleep. This is delta sleep. This is really deep sleep. And beyond that, we have one stage deeper, which is the melatonin sleep. Our body takes serotonin and converts it into melatonin. This is methylation. Buzzword right now. We've been talking about it for 20 years. But when you take a methyl group and just a carbon, and you stick it onto it, where does it get that carbon? CO2 usually. But it sticks a methyl group onto serotonin, you get melatonin. And so serotonin and melatonin are really both deep sleep transmitters. But that's super vulnerable. This is super deep sleep, super slow waveforms. So you don't want to do it for too long. You do it for a short burst of time. And then what happens is the body would speed up a little bit to check the environment. It's like peeking up, making sure everything's okay. You're not awake, but you're faster again. So it's brain vigilance. You're surveying, and if anything was there, you could wake up. But once everything's okay, then we go into what's called REM sleep, rapid eye movement. It's a fast brainwave, but your body's paralyzed. If you've ever woken up and you can't move your body at all, but your brain's awake, yep, that's coming out of REM into that vigilant N2 state, right?
It's like you're falling, but I can't move. Like I'm done. Like I want to get off the couch, but I can't move my body. It's
right. Because you're checking things around, but you're coming out of REM, and it's like, God, just let me wake up. And once you go up to that stage again and everything's okay, then everything slows down again, and you go into serotonin and melatonin, and then you speed back up a little bit, and then you go to REM and you speed back up a little bit, and then so your body's constantly going through these every 90 minutes. And a sleep cycle is usually 90 minutes, going from light sleep to deep sleep to light sleep to REM and back to light. That usually takes 90 minutes. And if you're going to plan your sleep schedule, think about it in hour and a halves. That's like 3 hours if you're going to take a nap, even though you shouldn't. That's what you want. An hour and a half, or 3 hours, or 4.5, or 6 hours, or 7.5. That's why we say 8 hours of sleep. You're going to get 7.5 of quality sleep cycles. 5 sleep cycles is what we want to try to go through. Minimum.
Well, that's awesome information. Just pulling that back to what we kicked that off with the alcohol and nicotine, what we do to keep us awake or to relax us while we're awake can greatly negatively affect our sleep. And obviously we know alcohol has an effect on GABA, and what you're saying, the majority of people are stuck in that N2 sleep, and they can't even get into N3 or REM, and they're not completing the cycle for the full hour and a half, never mind 5 cycles.
Right. And if you look at people when they do a sleep study, if you look at how much time they spend in each of those stages, it tells you a lot. Most people are spending 50 to 60% in light sleep, and very little deep and very little REM. Now, if we look at what they actually do, how much time they do spend in those cycles, that tells us where we could look at nutrition, because you can't have a sleep stage if you don't have a neurotransmitter.
Yeah. Also, if you're having potentially like memory problems, maybe it's not so much the alcohol, but it's also the lack of sleep that you can't remember things short and long term.
Or consolidate or learn new things. There's memories and there's learning.
Correct.
A lot of people don't learn from what they do in the daytime, and a lot of people don't remember. And there's a difference in what we're trying to do with our brain, because it comes down to voltage, and making new connections is hard. Learning is hard, and that's what they always say. It's the older you get, the harder it is to learn things, because it takes a lot more energy. So we focus on the memories rather than the learning.
So now, how do we get people more energy to get them to learn better while they're sleeping?
Well, interesting though, that process of going from a really slow brainwave to a really fast, back to a slow, back to a fast, is how we actually clear toxins out of our brain. And this is one of the keys to Alzheimer's. Alzheimer's is not about the plaques and the beta amyloids. A beta amyloid, or the plaque in your brain, is like a Band-Aid. If you've got a torn neuron, you want to put some duct tape on it, or it's going to leak. And what we're doing is we're saying, if we rip the duct tape off, we're fixing the problem. No, we're not. we're actually weakening the system. And I think the number one thing that the brain needs is choline. And choline, these days, if you live in a Western society, most people are deficient in choline. In fact, we've been told to avoid choline for the past 50 years. I mean, since the 70s, choline has been bad. You know, where do we get choline from? Egg yolks. Oh, but I'm healthy. I want an egg white omelet. I'm going for the healthy option in restaurants and stuff. No, the healthy option would be a bowl of egg yolks or the whole egg with
Eat those
runny.
cholesterol foods, people.
Yeah, what's the cholesterol and choline are what make your brain. What is an egg? It's the raw products for your brain.
And your brain looks like an egg. So, I mean, just look at the geometry of, the fluidity of the egg yolk and how your brain sits in the totally encased organ in a sack of fluid like the egg yolk.
Right. And it's
same design.
And that's why you want the white makes the methyl groups and the proteins, and the yolk has the cholesterol and the choline and the membrane around it. And that's why you want runny yolks, though, not scrambled, not hard boiled. You want the yolks to be runny so that choline is still viable for your brain.
So you're recommending when people eat eggs to have them, a little runny or over easy, not scrambled or hard boiled and things of that nature to get that true benefit of the choline.
Correct. And there's nothing more wasteful than an egg white omelet.
Yeah. Well, the fact that, I think I fell victim to it being an athlete. You're a former athlete and you're just, industry gets involved with messaging and they put this fat-free thing out there. And then all of a sudden people's cholesterols go through the roof and then stop eating meat and all these other things that you need to make these essential amino acids that we talked about before, with the aromatic ring and everything like that. So it's pretty much impossible without animal proteins to live a healthy life, folks. It's just irrefutable in biochemistry.
We have essential fatty acids. We have essential amino acids. There's really only one essential carbohydrate, chocolate. Lowest sugar as possible. But these are essential. And protein is one of those things that is, that's what makes every neurotransmitter you have to have the protein to do it. And as compared to the sugars, you don't need those nearly as much. Your body will turn proteins into sugar if you need it. You know me, I'm a more fan of a much higher protein intake than the low carb stuff. But in order to deal with the proteins, you have to have the stomach acid. Same with the minerals. And that's why I think if they had to eliminate two things to help the society, it would be get rid of the statins and the PPIs, the antacids. Because with those two things, you're not getting the proteins, you're not getting the cholines, you're not getting the cholesterol. They're just two of the worst things, that you could put in your system. And I don't understand, yet they're the most prescribed drugs you're going to get.
And think about the lifeline too, when we start building up oxidative stress and you hit that fourth decade of life and people go to their primary care doctor, and I meet a lot of people that are put on these things prophylactically, and it's actually not good for their health, long term, because it's destroying the things they need to break down to have these mineral processes actually work. If I'm hearing what you're telling me correctly.
You got to have the battery and you got to have the enzyme. And that's a protein and a mineral.
Yeah. How about, we talked about the sleep stages a little bit. Some people live different jobs and things like that. Like, how important is it to get to sleep at a certain time, or is it more about just getting those cycles in?
There's two ways to deal with it. In a perfect world, if we look at sleep stages, when the sun starts to go down and we feel sleep pressure, we know our schedule, and okay, we can go to sleep, and we go through those sleep stages uninterrupted, and we wake up refreshed and we start our day. And then there's reality, right? When it comes to setting things up, there's two things we look at in sleep. Well, three really. But number one is our sleep schedule, right? And a sleep schedule is has to overlay what is termed circadian rhythm sleep disorders. This is the normal rhythm of the body. This is, like I said, in a perfect world, when we can control our environment, one of the most important things for sleep is sleep schedule. It's more important than sleep time, like the time you go to bed. It's the regularity of it. As long as it's getting dark, your body knows that it's going to go into this relaxing time. And the most important thing to do, in my opinion, to set up sleep success is to have a sleep schedule. I'm going to sleep for my 8 hours. Now, that could be 10 to 6. That could be 12 to 8, right? 11 to 7. How do you want to plan 8 hours? And if you get a little more, great, right? So if you're going to bed at 9 o'clock to get up at what time, right? 5 a.m., 10 to 6, 12 to 8. I'm a 12 to 8. Just, it works. That's why, if we come to our courses, we don't start at 8, right?
Well, cortisol doesn't kick on at 9 a.m. anyway, so you're just wasting hours not talking to anybody because no one's listening.
Right. And that overlays your body's natural cortisol pattern, which is low at night and it's highest at 9 a.m. And so if you want to wake up, if you're waking up at 5 a.m., to me, why? It's still dark. But life hits. You got to work, got to do these things, all right? Okay, that's when life schedule doesn't align with biological schedule. I think the biological schedule, in my opinion, is more like 11 to 7. For most people, I'm 12 to 8 just because I got to wind down and how things work. But that's another thing about eating breakfast when your cortisol is really high. It doesn't work. If you wait till 11, you're going to get a lot more digestion. You're going to get a lot more nutrients. You're going to get a lot more out of your system, out of the food that you eat by pushing breakfast back. I mean, break fast was developed by breakfast food companies.
Yeah, so you're saying, let's say you're waking up at 7 or 8, you should wait till after 9 when the cortisol peaks, somewhere between like 9 and 11 to actually fuel your body because it'll be broken down properly.
Right, and you won't be competing with the cortisol. You won't have sugar. You won't have these other things in your system as long if you wait a little bit longer. But everybody should just say, okay, what is my sleep schedule going to be? Now, if I know I'm going to go to bed at, we'll say 11 o'clock at night. Okay, we're going to say I'm going to be on 11 to 7 or at 10 to 6. If I'm going to be on 11 to 7 schedule, I know that 2 hours before that, I have to start preparing for that active sleep.
Yeah, it's like sleep hygiene, right? That's what we're kind of talking about.
And getting ready for it. Yep. So you start shutting things down. You start winding things up. You think about the things that would disrupt your sleep. Are the doors locked? You do this check an hour or two before you go to bed, not right before you go into bed. You get the lights down lower. You turn off a lot of the fluorescence. If you're going to watch television, don't do it on a tablet or a phone in your face where it's going to hit you with the lights. If things are going to, mess with your brain, did I do this? Did I turn the stove off? Do all of these things. The kids say everything's happy, puppies are fed, way beforehand so that you can just sort of get into it. Let the sleep pressure come on, and then you go to sleep. That's setting yourself up for success, just like anything else in life, Some people, it helps to write things down in that hour before you go to bed that you're going to do the next day. Write those things down. Write it all, have your schedule. This is where the old day planner schedule is what executives used to do, and that's one of the keys to productive days. It's also a key to productive sleep. is setting your schedule up so that you can do that. Another thing is stop the sugar at least 2 hours before you go to bed, because this has a lot to do with hormones at night. One of the things that happens is that if we have insulin in our blood when we go to bed because we've had a sugar burst, this is the thing that it turns off certain hormones and turns on other hormones. Insulin will keep cortisol high. Insulin at night will increase inflammation. Insulin is going to turn off a hormone called antidiuretic hormone. Because if we have glucose in our blood at night, we're going to pee it out. And the body is hard to tell between glucose and insulin. If you have insulin in your blood, obviously we have glucose in our blood and we're going to pee. So if we don't have this antidiuretic hormone working at night, then we can't hold our bladder throughout the night. Really important for children as well.
Again, also going back to the alcohol thing, as people unwind a glass of vino within that 2-hour sleep compression stage, this is how it's affecting you negatively through your hormone system, because it's changing the response in there.
And especially if you're a slow processor, if you're already toxic and overloaded, you're gonna see that happen.
Or a bad methylator, right? We touched on that earlier. There's this craze in methylation that people are just doing methylation tests like crazy and looking at the downstream. But we already explained, why you don't do melatonin. Just one step before is serotonin, right? And then there's several other steps to that.
Right. And it could just be a low methyl groups, low methionine. Where do you get your best methionine from? Egg whites.
As nature intended.
Yeah, that's why we also want to make sure we have, if we're going to snack on anything in that final window, it should be protein. Bacon.
Yeah, I don't think I've ever woken up at night after having a steak in my life. I've slept better.
I put you to sleep, it's like,
yeah.
But if you're going to eat your carbohydrates, that's what you should do midday. Because in midday, you've got the time to process them. And, so if you want to have those things, you can have it earlier in the evening if that's what you're going to do. Some people are very slow, and that's where you do have to look at things like genetics. And methylation does play a role. I mean, we were teaching methylation way back when we were young. And now it's becoming trendy again, which is interesting to see. But there's so much more to it. And that's why, I like a methylation profile test, because it will tell you, is it a gene or is it a raw product? And you can tell when people are just overall deficient. Looked at a study today where somebody who just wasn't making any methylation because they're not eating methyl groups. So another study today where all the hormones were low because they're not even getting the things they need to do to make cholesterol. So you need to make cholesterol, you need to have methyl groups, you need to do these things chemically, or if you don't have raw products, don't expect the engine to run.
Yeah, I think that a lot of, the big push is like there's something wrong with your genes, but people don't even have the raw product. And you just mentioned 2 cases of just not having the right fuel to put the system into play.
Well, genetics loads the gun, lifestyle and environment pull the trigger. And so you can have genetic polymorphisms, but you can work around them if you know what they are. But either way, if you don't have the raw products, if you're deficient in the basics, don't expect any of them to work. All genes do is affect enzymes. If you don't have the enzyme and the battery, that enzyme's not going to work anyway. If you want to maximize everything, make sure you have your raw products, make sure you have the batteries for those enzymes. And then if you know those that aren't working right, well, there's a lot of workarounds. There's a lot of ways you can work around things like that. And most people might not even notice they're there because they're not that severe. And if you know you do have them, then yeah, there's things you can avoid and there's things you can take. If you can't make it, take it. But if you can, work around it.
I always like avoiding because that's free.
Yeah.
That people sometimes get overwhelmed with change, and I was like, listen, here's 3 things you can do that are free, and just stop doing it. But if I'm picking up what you're saying, whether it's methylation or a raw product, there's ways to work with either end of the spectrum. We just got to get you tested and see what's going on with that.
Exactly. There's a lot of ways we can do that, In addition to that, like I said, with sleep, when we talked about sleep hygiene, people need to think of their bedrooms as a sleep cave. It's like I love to watch these, home ownerships and remodeling things. Oh, I like my bedroom. It's so light and airy. I don't want a bright bedroom, because you want it to be a sleep cave. You want it to be dark. You want it to be slightly cooler because there's a body temperature cycle that happens. So you want the bedroom to be cooler than the rest of the environment. You want it to be darker. You want it to be quiet. You want it to be this little, fortress of solitude. You want to have a sleep cave. If you're for some people, that wind down stage involves, getting into bed, turning on a television for that last little bit of mindless stuff. That's okay, as long as they know that they can turn things off and their cave is there, because that's reality. I personally don't like to. I like to do all that stuff outside the cave. And when I go into the sleep, you can go to sleep very quickly because everything's done. Everything around you, you're not worrying about. You enter into that sleep realm and you go to sleep.
I think the brain also recognizes, like if you're working on your laptop before bed, recognizes that space as workspace, not as the cave. This is where I go to sleep space.
Right. It's setting up that environment for success.
I think you touched on something key. Obviously there's 3 things that happen before pain and structural work, especially through chiropractic, with nervous system dysfunction. With number 1 being posture, which we talk about in chirodontics, and then we have touch and dysregulation, and then we've got temperature dysregulation. There's a lot of people out there that don't have good structure, that have temperature dysregulation, and they're using a lot of different apparatuses out there. I've seen things for like cold blankets and all these other things that people do. What do you think about that?
They have utility, but you're trying to use them to bypass or to overcome what your own system isn't doing. Because a lot of the heat regulation, temperature regulation has to do with sugar, cortisol, and thyroid. And if the thyroid's not working right, then you're going to see hot and cold not being able to regulate properly. As soon as we see people that are always too hot or too cold, think thyroid. But there's, electromagnetic grounding mats and things like that. Grounding mats are really good when people are mentally frenetic and they do need some baseline tone, but that is also what some of your neurotransmitters should normally be doing. And you can overcome that, though some people are very electromagnetic sensitive. And if they're not in a grounded environment, then it can be really useful. I think in addition to working on other ways to ground yourself. But once again, I find a lot of that to be that setting yourself up for that. When it comes to neurotransmitters, the things that starting out sleep, normally our brain makes GABA. However, we can use things like theanine. Theanine is a body calming, or serine is a brain calming. Now, how many people out there, when they're going to sleep and they lay down to sleep, their body is still up and going? If your body is keeping you awake, that is where L-theanine is really useful. But then there's the other class of people that they close their eyes and all of a sudden their brain becomes frontal lobe active, and they're figuring out ways to save the world, and they get what we call brain chatter.
Yeah, monkey mind.
Yeah, that is where serine is very useful.
So do you think they should focus on foods with those, or they could actually take the actual supplement for that specific situation?
Well, the foods are always, it depends upon how well their body processes it. You'll find that people that need serine tend to be low in choline because the body makes both out of each other.
Okay.
Serine, choline, ethanolamine, they kind of compete. People that are low in choline is really hard for your body to make. It's biochemically expensive, as we would say. It takes a lot. It takes more methyl groups than almost anything in the body, creatine and choline. So choline's hard to make. If you're not getting enough in your diet, then you'll find that the body will make choline over serine or one or the other. Now you need choline to dream, and you need serine to shut your brain off. So what are you going to do? If you can get enough choline in your diet, if you're, say, carnivore, that's why you see it tend to help a lot of people. But the eggs and the stuff with higher choline, muscle tissue and eggs, yolks have the most choline. If you're getting enough of the choline, you'll also notice brain chatter. It's free, right? Well, it's not free. You still got to buy the meat and the eggs and the other stuff. But serine is really useful for that. But L-theanine is super calming, just like GABA. Now, if your body doesn't make GABA well, which is actually common, there's a gene SNP for GABA, GABA1, GABA2. You don't make it well. If you're toxic, you won't make GABA well, because the glutamine is what you use to get rid of ammonia, and a lot of the other things that are in there, your body's going to use to make glutathione for your brain to get rid of metals and these other things. So if you're competing and your body wants to survive, it's going to make the most important survival nutrients, which aren't necessarily sleep, because sleep's vulnerable, right? And so if you're going to be just trying, your brain's not trying to heal itself, it's trying to survive the night. So what is it? What are its priorities? And our job is to figure out what it's not doing and help the body to do that, because it's based on here, now, brainstem, survival. I want to make it through the night to the next day. If that means I'm going to suffer sleep, oh, so be it. Whereas if we can take all those other things around, because long term, we want to sleep. Short term, the brain says, heck with you, I just want to wake up. You know?
Yeah, interesting points here. So, for the people listening out there, nutrition-wise, if you're getting a monkey brain, you're a little anxious when you're trying to lay down to rest, we need to eat a little more foods with choline in it, which is our egg yolk. So, you can plan that into your diet, some steak and eggs. Who doesn't like a steak and eggs for their dinner? And obviously, posture-wise, I see a lot of people coming here with what they think is restless leg syndrome, but we know it's just the body's trying to offload a joint that is not happy. But also, it could be a neurotransmitter issue, and you're saying the theanine can help relax those body jerks.
Very much so. Especially right when you get those as you're falling to sleep, when you feel that. The body twitchy part. For that next step of sleep, though, that norepinephrine, that vigilant stage, some people just go from that super light sleep to deep back, and they're constantly waking up. They're waking up. And you see multiple awakenings or arousals during the nighttime, and they're always waking up and they're not getting a length of sleep. The number one thing that we do to make them stay in that stage 2, that vigilant sleep, you're not awake, but you're not deep, structure. And we know that anytime we have joint problems, anytime we have pain, anytime we have things going on, that stage is weak because you're always waking up. That's why you notice people sleep really good after they get adjusted properly. without a doubt. In addition, the body needs vitamin C to make norepinephrine. And that's why your body will turn dopamine into norepinephrine. Then in the rest of the body, it turns it into epinephrine or adrenaline. But turning dopamine into norepinephrine requires vitamin C, along with copper's the battery. And that vitamin, that's why people say when they're adrenal burnt out or they're, adrenal fatigue, they need more vitamin C. They just need it for that first step. What's the difference between norepinephrine and epinephrine? One methyl group. So that is methylation. But you got to make the dopamine into norepinephrine. And this is where vitamin C comes into play. And people that you're seeing multiple awakenings throughout the night, that's a vitamin C before bed. But not the sugary sweet forms. Vitamin C is super similar to glucose. And that's why it's usually found combined with glucose, because they're super similar molecules. But this is where you want to do it earlier in the day. It's just an overall deficiency. But that's one of the things that shows vitamin C is not there, as well as copper. Now we're seeing copper a lot these days because of, post the big crazy pandemic, a lot of people took zinc, rightly so. But high zinc depletes copper. And we need them in balance. And that's why copper has its uses in certain enzymes. This is one of them.
Yeah, and copper also controls iron, right, in the biochemistry, just like magnesium controls calcium, right? So we got these other things that are, readily prescribed to people with bone loss and this and that and energy deficiency, but we just need to give them something else that controls it so that it can balance itself out, not what it's low in.
Right. You want the balance. And another thing that really messes with this enzyme that turns the frontal lobe off and allows you to go a little bit deeper, a lot of gut bacteria, a lot of Clostridia for one, inhibits the enzyme that actually turns it off. So your body wants to stay awake when you have this gut dysbiosis. So we see that there's certain enzyme in your brain that the toxins that some of the gut bacteria make turn this off. So we see a lot of people that have, they go from super light to deep to super light to deep. They skip that middle stage. We also want to consider gut. So the first thing I always look at on those things is structure and vitamin C. Then we can test to see whether we have these bacterial toxins and gut, anaerobic bacteria in the gut. Clostridia is number one. So we can
nobody
check.
on this podcast ever thought a sleep study would help them realize they have gut health problems because they're missing a sleep stage part of it.
A sleep study is one of the best functional health tests you can do, non-invasive. You don't need any blood or anything else, but it tells you a heck of a lot about the way the body's working.
Yeah, and people just think it's for a CPAP or not, right? And here we are talking about all these other health factors that a simple take-home sleep study can be interpreted a different way and all this other information. And that's why we start off today's talk about the physiological side of sleep and the nutrient side and the biochemistry of it.
Right. See, and we haven't even talked about melatonin.
You don't need it if you're making the precursors. It already does its job.
And if you're making what's the difference between serotonin and melatonin? One methyl group. Yeah. One methyl group, right? It's always the end stage, that methyl group. But if you don't have serotonin, who cares? And in order to get serotonin, you have to have tryptophan, you have to have vitamin D, you have to have these other things. So if you're deficient in those, who cares?
Just eat a turkey sandwich outside at lunch in a river, you'll be all right.
You'll see a lot of people these days that are saying that I'm sensitive to methyl groups. It's kind of a buzzword. I'm sensitive to methyl groups because you don't have the precursors. And if you don't have any of the precursors, all you're doing is, trying to light that final fire, and it just doesn't work that way. It can actually cause inflammation. And that's not the answer we want. So if we can make GABA, if we can't, we can use theanine and serine. If we can't make norepinephrine, there aren't a lot of solutions. We're just going to stay in dopamine state. And we won't be able to do epinephrine or norepinephrine. If we're over cortisol stressed, we won't make norepinephrine because the body says, I got cortisol. Why should I waste my energy on that if I'm already stressed? We need the tryptophan to make serotonin. Now people say, oh, you make most of the serotonin in your gut. Yeah, but no transmitters made in your gut are used in your brain. And this is just wrong.
Can you say that again? Because people don't understand this either.
I know. Your body uses neurotransmitters in the whole body. Neurotransmitters just aren't in your brain. But when we make serotonin in our gut, it is not used in our brain. It's used in our gut. You say, well, most of the immune system is in your gut. Yeah, because your gut's like a mile long, and that's inside, outside. It's your border. So yeah, your border patrol is going to be more abundant in your border, not in your cells. But that doesn't make things for the rest of the body. Gut-derived neurotransmitters are not used in the brain.
And I don't even think people realize that the brain breathes different than the rest of the body. We had talked about respiration earlier, and that there's a different mechanism of breathing in the brain than it is the rest of the body.
Yeah, and it's a part of it, and your brain only uses respiration as its pH buffer. The rest of the body is what uses all these minerals and other things. And that's what can set up other pH problems, And in order to dream, what do you need? Acetylcholine. And so if you don't have choline, how can you make acetylcholine, right? But that acetyl group, where do you get acetyl groups from? One of the best ways to get acetyl groups is apple cider vinegar. Vinegars are acetic acid. That's a bioavailable, very inexpensive way to get acetyl groups to make acetylcholine. Because your body recycles acetyls. You can make it, and a lot of times it's actually gut fermentation that makes acetyl groups. So that's the good bacteria doing their job, and that's kind of what fibers can do and other things. And if people aren't dreaming at all, try a little apple cider vinegar in that wind down stage, in that 2 hours before bed.
See, they could still have a shot just of this apple cider vinegar, not wine.
Yeah. Well, that is one of the ways that wine actually works from that effect. That's why it can do that.
And it's funny how the brain craves it, but it's just the wrong application for what it wants, right?
It's the sugar in it that messes with the rest of the system.
Yeah, right. It's the same thing. They're mirror images, just one no sugar, one without sugar, and to get the same effect.
And you'll get a larger effect with a little bit if you're not dreaming. And that's why I said a sleep study is going to say, are we getting our first stage sleep? Are we getting our second stage sleep? Are we getting our third? And are we getting our REM? So we can see nutrient needs from a sleep study right there. And that's why if you look at everything that the body needs for proper health, it also equals proper sleep.
Yeah. Welcome to the game, people, of neurology and biochemistry, and how we could assess this not only through structural, but also a sleep study to see how you're metabolically functioning and to better help you have a better, healthy life.
I think a simple sleep study, a simple take-home sleep study is one of the best functional tests you can do for the cost, for the information you get, and non-invasive, no blood, no sticks, no labs. It doesn't have to be on a permanent health record. And, even I hate to say it, but some of those apps that use algorithms for sleep have utility, but they're not very accurate. But they do tell you things. And that's why the Oura Rings and some of the Apple apps and some of the other things that are trying to do it through sound, they do tell you things. Number one, they tell you the respiratory part, the snoring and the other stuff. They're very bad about the actual sleep stages.
And you want to get both. So just so people understand, when we're doing a sleep study, we're looking at the respiration side, and there's a lot of things to look for there, ratios you'll need to be concerned with. But then there's also wanting to measure the sleep stages so we can see what stage you are getting into, what you're not, and what minerals and vitamins might help you adjust that, right? So we want to make sure to studies measuring both sides of that.
And most of the cheap forms, the apps and the rings and stuff, are really bad at that. They're guessing. But I always say all information is useful. It's just how you interpret it. And they have utility, especially for if they're matching what you're seeing on sleep studies, like for daily maintenance and things like that. They'll tell you how many hours of sleep you got, how many times you wake up based on other things. They don't give you the details I think you need, but they're useful. And that's why I said in our sleep course coming up, we're going to spend a lot of time on interpreting these sleep studies so that doctors can understand this is all the information you're getting out of a sleep test that you didn't even know was there.
And I think the interpretation is important too, because I've dealt with personally in my own family and dealing with other clients that they're going to the ENT or they're going to their medical doctor, and some of them are wanting to do surgeries or CPAPs without any sleep study, which is crazy, but their associations allow for that. Like they will tell you, like, I'm not committing malpractice because we can recommend this surgery without a sleep study. But I'm like, how do you know if it's obstructive or inflammation without that test? How are you making that assumption? Which I think is very, very dangerous for people. And then when they look at it, they're only looking at what you mentioned earlier, the AHI. They're not looking at any of your physiological factors. And then a lot of the tests they recommend are not including sleep stages for people.
Right. And they're looking at AHI, which is 3 parts, and they're breaking it all down into obstruction, which it isn't. And the more studies you look at, the more you find out that the obstructive component can be very small compared to the physiologic components, which are the other 2. And yet they're still recommending surgery and CPAP. And it just doesn't make sense. Now, if the obstructive component is really high, if the can't breathe is really high, by all means, breathe. And yet, if the other components, like a CPAP, will actually make central apnea worse because you're not dealing with why.
Toxicity.
And if you're hyperventilating, you're lowering CO2, and the body's going to say, well, wait, what I wanted was to get my CO2 up, and you're making it harder to do. Therefore, what am I supposed to do?
And then if the glucose is attached, right, like you were saying before, they're permanently stuck in a metabolic dysfunctional state, and they're obese and they can't lose weight.
Right. And therefore they've got these other things. And if they're insulin resistant, because a lot of this is going on, then at nighttime their insulin's going to be high. They're going to wake up and have to go to the toilet a lot. They're never going to go into a deeper sleep. They're going to stay vigilant, and you'll never get repair. You might sleep for 10 hours, but you're not getting any repair or any integration or any memory consolidation or any flushing of the toxins out of your head. And sleep, that's what sleep's for, not just to kill 10 hours a day. It's not an off time by any means. It's not passive. Sleep is an active event that needs to be considered just like an 8-hour workout. And you want to prepare yourself for sleep success. And that requires certain things. But the more you know about what's happening when you're sleeping, the more you can better prepare for that event.
Yeah, I think you hit the nail on the head right there. I mean, people plan their whole day, but they don't plan their sleep. And then if you don't have any data of what's going on there, you're shooting fish in a barrel, which could be fatal to your life. And obviously, if you don't want to be healthy, just put a CPAP on and just deal with it. But if you want to be healthy, you need good information to make good choices. And that's why, we had Dr. Walker on today, and this conversation could go on forever. We're going to keep it going. We've got the sleep course coming up. I wrote a little sleep book for some people, and this is just really the tip of the iceberg. And this is how we can help people be healthier by measuring what's going on in your sleep.
Yep. And I think you should, if you plan your day for success, why not plan your night for success?
Well, I think we're good to end there, Dr. Walker, because it's people don't think about that. And we're going to let them ponder about planning for success and the tools that they need to do that. So I can't thank you enough for your time and energy and effort.
That covers all of these things really well too.
Yeah. Coming from a different continent, a different day, different time, we made it happen. as always.
Different time, different season. It's tomorrow already for you.
But we all need to sleep, right? It's universal. It's a universal problem. So.
And that's, there's strategies for jet lag and swing shift workers and all that kind of stuff. Just got to know what it is and plan for it.
Yeah, and I think that's something we should, we need to touch on too, because some people are bound to their situation, whether they're, second or third shift worker, or they have to travel for work. We want to be able to help those people too. So, all right, thank you. We'll talk soon.
And you get some sleep.
I'm going to now. I'm going to plan my sleep for 2 hours before bed. Going to get that choline going.
Good luck.
All right, thank you.